Hey guys, it's Kevin again, my review for Rambo Last Blood. And what Rambo Last Blood is essentially about is basically after the events of the 2008 film, Rambo has really settled down with an old friend of his, and he has basically started up a family with this friend. He is now raising her granddaughter as basically his own. He's grown this very tight bond and everything, and one day his basically daughter, she is going to meet up with her biological father and things like that, and she ends up getting kidnapped by all of these human traffickers, and now Rambo has to try to track her down and also exact revenge to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again, and that's really all I'm going to say. So, Rambo Last Blood overall, I wasn't really all that excited for this film. Prior to it, I had not seen a single Rambo film, but before this film, I made sure to go back and watch all of the Rambo films, and I'll just say right now, I'm not really the biggest fan of this series. The first one, I think, is a fantastic film. It's a really great character study of someone who has severe PTSD and how they really do, and how this has really affected them, but also just how disgruntled they are in society for not really acknowledging soldiers and the efforts that they worked. And I think it's a really great film, but I kind of wish it was a standalone, because all the sequels that come after it, minus the fourth one, which I do actually think is quite good, most of them feel very forced, and they just didn't really do much of anything for me. The fourth film, I do think, like I said, was quite good. It definitely put Rambo back on the right track for sure. But even after watching that film, I'm like, what else can we really do with this character? Where else can he really go? So I didn't really know where Rambo Last Blood was going to go overall. There were a couple things that they left open that I was interested in seeing if maybe they would dive into. So like I said, I went to Rambo Last Blood not really knowing how it would turn out, and it kind of sucks. I'm not going to lie. Rambo Last Blood, though it is not the worst of the Rambo sequels, is still a really, really disappointing final installment for sure that barely even feels like much of a Rambo movie, but we're just getting to right now, starting off with the cast. And look, I'll just say right now, that has always been a low point when it comes to the Rambo films for me. I do think that in the earlier films, there definitely were some standouts. Richard Crenna, I always thought was really good as a Troutman. I thought their rapport, was always really great. But most of these Rambo films, they just have not had that great of acting. I think that the acting, it's always been not the thing that is the focus, and that was clear to me, especially when it came to the sequels. I mean, even the fourth one, Julie Benz, holy shit, she was really bad, and unfortunately, that is the case with this film. Most of the acting here just isn't that great. With the exception of Sylvester Stallone, I still think he did do a really great job here. He's always been great in this role. He's always been one of the best things about this franchise, and that still is the case here. All these years later, at 70 years old, he still is fantastic as this character. You really do see what Rambo has gone through. He still has that badassery to him. He still has that relentless edge to him, and he still does do a really great job as this character. There's not a single point in this movie where you're not convinced that this is the same John Rambo, that this guy is so relentless in that way, that he is still just as brutal as he was in the first four movies. And I think Stallone did a really great job of that. I feel like a lesser actor, and even, especially at Stallone's age, would not be able to pull it off. But Stallone really, I think, conducted himself very well here. I was very impressed by his performance here for sure, especially in the last act of this movie. He has a lot of meaty scenes, and he definitely does deliver here. And for me, was easily probably the best thing about this entire film. Now, everything else, yeah, this is where we get into my major issues. The directing here just really isn't that great. I mean, the directing here, the last film was directed by Sylvester Stallone. To be honest, I don't really know why this one wasn't either, because the directing in this film, it just isn't really all that great. I wouldn't say it's bad necessarily, but Adrian Grunberg's directing, clearly he did not know how to direct a Rambo film. And, I mean, the only other film he's directed prior to this is some movie with Mel Gibson, and it really does show that, this is not a very, experienced director. And look, I'm not saying the other Rambo films were amazingly directed. I mean, First Blood's directing is pretty phenomenal, but the other directing, is fine for sure. But this is definitely some of the worst I've seen in the entire franchise. I mean, he just seems to have no idea what he wanted this movie to be. Does he want it to be a big budget action film, or does he want it to be more of this, thriller? I mean, to be honest with you, this doesn't even really feel like much of a Rambo film. And I know everyone said this, but it feels much more like something in the Taken series, where he is trying to shine a light on, like, human trafficking and things like that. And I just don't know if Rambo was the right vehicle to do that with. And I just don't think his directing worked all that well here, especially for the first two acts. It just feels very off. It's very hard to tell what he's going for. Once we got to the third act, I will say, the directing got a lot better. The film turned into what you wanted it to be. It started to feel much more like a Rambo film in that way. But the first two acts, it feels like something different entirely, and it just didn't really work here overall. Overall, the directing here, it's just very tone-deaf. It did not really seem like Grunberg knew what to do directing-wise, and it really does show here. The writing, though, is easily my biggest complaint, because the story in this film just isn't very interesting at all, especially if you watch 2008's Rambo and then going back to this, you're going to be extremely confused. The way that 2008's Rambo leaves off, if you remember, Rambo is meeting up with his dad, and you're thinking in this one there's going to be some mention of that, and aside from a brief thing that we hear about that I'm not going to get into, there's barely any mention of it. Nothing in the franchise feels like it's been building up to this, and this is supposed to be the final installment in the Rambo franchise, and at no point really feels like one. It just feels like a random entry, and look, this has been a complaint throughout this entire series for me, minus, I would say, the first and the fourth. Most of these films do feel very random. They don't really feel like they've had that continuity that they really do need, and that's the exact case, and this film is probably the worst offense of that. It doesn't feel like it was going in this direction at all, and it also just doesn't really feel like this is about Rambo anymore. It's far more about human trafficking and things like that. And I get it, Rambo as a series always reflected things that were going in like the political systems and things like that. And by design, yes, that is something that they're going to try to, you know, shed a light on. I totally understand that. I just don't think this film handled it too well. And I think because of that, it got in the way of being a Rambo film. Because Rambo as a character is honestly kind of stagnant here. It doesn't really seem like they have much more growth to do with this character. It doesn't really seem like they have anything left to really add to him, and I think that really brings this entire film down. This is supposed to be Rambo's movie, and aside from the fact that Rambo is a badass, and he does still have few visions about, like, you know, the Vietnam War and things like that, there just isn't much to this character anymore. And the thing that sucks is that I don't think it had to be this way. There were multiple points in the movie where I saw ways that they really could have peeled back the layers of this character more. Seeing him raise a family is not something we've seen before in this franchise. We could have had a movie of him trying to, you know, raise this girl, like his daughter, and the connection that these two end up forming, but that's only really in like the first 20 or 30 minutes of this movie. She disappears very early on, and so because of that, we don't really have that connection to these characters. We don't really know them all that well, and it just makes for a viewing experience that just isn't particularly satisfying at all. I kept watching this film like, what really is the point? What is this all building up to? And I just don't think they did a very good job with honing in on giving Rambo something that he hasn't before. It doesn't really feel like anything that happens to Rambo in this movie, is really all that needed. Doesn't really feel like he goes through any sort of development here, and that is vastly disappointing to say the least. And look, again, the kidnapping stuff, yes, they do a good job at showing just how cruel and just how terrible of a situation this is, but it feels like the film should be doing more than that. Especially since it's supposed to be the last Rambo film, it feels like there should be a lot more going on. The stakes should be the highest they've ever been, and they're just not, and it really just brings this entire film down. It just isn't very well written. A lot of these characters also just aren't interesting at all. I did not like the daughter. I thought she was particularly very annoying. There were a lot of things that I just did not like about her character. The villains also are terrible here. I get it that they're supposed to be awful people, but they're basically just cartoons here. There's so many lines that I just thought were really badly written, and just overall, this movie just doesn't seem to have any idea what it's supposed to be, and I really do think it brings this entire film down. The cinematography isn't too bad here. I don't think that the cinematography was anything that bad necessarily. I don't really have any complaints on that front. It's nice to look at, I guess, and I will say, the film doesn't hold back, definitely. When it gets violent, it gets very violent, and I do definitely applaud them for that. And I don't think the film is racist either. I don't think that, I've heard a lot of people bring that up. I don't think that's the problem with this movie. The problem with the movie is that it's severely underwritten. It's not that it has these, like, racial undertones to them. Like, I don't know why people are, I think people are really overthinking what is basically just supposed to be a simple revenge story, and that's basically it. The score here I actually really liked. I think Brian Taylor composed a really great score here, and it's one of the only things about the movie that feels like a Rambo film in that way, and I do think his score was very effective. And the editing, I think this film was way too short. It's only 82 minutes, and honestly, there's never a... Look, this helps because you never really feel the runtime. Like, it never feels like it's going too slow. If anything, it feels too quick. It feels like we needed more time to dive into this relationship. We need more time to see Rambo on this ranch with his family, trying to live in solitude, trying to enjoy himself, to give us this false sense of security, so when shit actually goes down, we actually feel something. When in reality, I felt absolutely nothing because I just didn't care about these characters, unfortunately, and I just don't think the film was very well edited. I even read someone saying, like, the second act of this movie feels very, kind of like it was left out, and yeah, I very much agree with that. There's a point in this movie where you think that the story's gonna go somewhere, and then it just goes to basically the climax, and it was really weird overall. I don't know why they decided to go in this direction. Like, once you get to the third act, once you get to the second act of this movie, it's basically the third act. Like, there is no second act here, and it's very strange overall. Like, she gets kidnapped, and then very quickly the resolution ends up happening, and it's very weird the way that was put together. So yeah, I really didn't think the editing was that great here. I will give the movie this, though. The one thing it does have over Rambo 3, which I do still think is the worst in the franchise, is the last 20 minutes. The last 20 minutes is everything you love about the Rambo character. It is ferocious, it's brutal, it's extremely violent, and I loved every second of it. Everything about those last 20 minutes are fantastic. It's Rambo going on a full, it's Rambo going full-on Rambo, and it's great. I loved every second of where they end up going with that, and it's the only thing in this film that really felt like a Rambo movie, and suddenly everything got better after those last 20 minutes. The production got better, the story got a lot more interesting, the cinematography got a lot more interesting, it got a lot more creative with, like, what Rambo can do, and I just really loved it. Unfortunately, though, there is an hour that precedes that last 20 minutes, and that hour is pretty terrible, to be honest with you. It feels like a very tone-deaf movie. It doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. It's trying to tell a story about human trafficking that is important, but because of that, it completely just leads any sort of character development of Rambo left in the dust. There really isn't anything for him to do. It feels like, as a character, he's pretty stagnant at this point. Sylvester Stallone is still great here, but everyone else he's surrounded by can't really act to save their life. There's not really many good performances in this movie at all. And so at the end of the day, while I can say I didn't hate this movie, it's an extremely unsatisfying conclusion to the Rambo character that I honestly do hope we're done with. Like, as unsatisfying as it is, please be done, because they clearly don't have any ideas left for this character overall. Keep the Rocky franchise, that's fine, but as the Rambo franchise goes, I really do think this should be the end. I really do think this should be the way they just kind of, like, wrap things up altogether, because if it is anything clear, it is evidently clear after this movie that they have no direction for this character. They have no new ideas for where he can possibly go, and they're just going to keep exhausting all these different concepts that just don't really fit in a Rambo movie, and I think that's really the thing that brings this entire film down, is that, but also the fact that I think it is way too short after all. It screeches to a halt in its second act especially. So because of that, I really can't recommend Rambo Last Blood. I do think the last 20 minutes are fantastic, and if you want to see a really great climax, then, you know, go for it for sure. But you could probably find on like YouTube or something like that. Honestly, as a movie, it's just really not worth seeing because that first hour is just not really that great. It feels very lost in translation in that way. And you're waiting for that big, you know, like I said, all those big action set pieces, and you do eventually get it, but it just takes too long to get there. So unfortunately, because of that, I am going to give Rambo Last Blood overall a C-. And with that, guys, in my review of Rambo Last Blood, the most guys saw this movie overall, left your thoughts on it. We'll see you guys in my next video, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.